Okay, today we're going to talk about the nervous system. We're going to go over a little bit of structure and function and how they communicate and then organization of those. Oops, figure out how to use this. All right, so cells of the nervous system are typically the cell body, the dendrites. Let me get the laser pointer for you guys. We'll do green. Okay, so the cell body, the dendrites get the signal from other nerves, then it goes to the cell body, the impulse goes to the cell body, then the axon, an axon terminal region. We have some other lingo. The presynaptic nerve or presynaptic cell is the one that usually originates in the central nervous system, which would be the brain and spinal cord. Then we have an interneuron sometimes, and then a postsynaptic nerve. In between the pre and post is a synapse or a synaptic cleft. And then we have support cells like your Schwann cells, your satellite cells, and glial cells. This is some of the anatomy that you covered in the previous semester. Here is a picture of the neuron. So the dendrites get the signal from other cells or other nerves, and then the signal goes to the cell body. It's generated into action potential at the axon hillock, and then it goes down the axon to the axon terminal regions. And then at the terminal regions, you release neurotransmitter, and that neurotransmitter is either going to connect to another nerve or to a skeletal muscle or smooth muscle or cardiac or what have you. Notice that this axon, if you go back to the axon, this axon has Schwann cells that make up the myelin sheath. This is an insulated fatty layer that helps speed up transmission. It's an insulation, and it allows the impulse to jump from node of Ranvier to node of Ranvier to node of Ranvier. And this is fatty acids, so it's important to have your omega-3 fatty acids in your diet. That's going to help with the myelin sheath. Here is a stain or histological slide of a nerve cell. Here are the dendrites that goes into the cell body, and then the axon hillock and the axon region. Then we have the supporting stuff like your astrocytes. Your microglia is actually a macrophage that protects the nerve cells. To conduct an impulse, you covered this in anatomy, so there's two types of conduction, normal conduction and saltatory propagation. Normal conduction means that the action potential is generated down the axon. So this region depolarizes and then it travels to this region, et cetera, et cetera. Saltatory propagation is when there's nodes of Ranvier exposed or nodes of the nerve exposed, so that node depolarizes, then it jumps to that node, then it jumps to that node, then it jumps to that node. And this increases the conduction velocity. This is usually found in reflexes and places where you want to increase nerve conduction velocity. Let's talk about how the impulse actually crosses the synapse. So how does one nerve communicate with another nerve? Or how does a nerve communicate with, let's say, the heart or digestive tract or skeletal muscle? Well, first, if you look at this picture down on the left-hand side, here's a nerve synapsing with another nerve. And so this nerve is going to excite the second nerve. And so if you go back to the axon, if you look at number 1, let me change the color of the laser pointer so you can actually see it a little bit better. Okay, so we're at step number 1. The action potential is going to move down the axon until it hits the axon terminal region. How does that action potential go down the axon? Okay, now we've had a couple of weeks of break, so you got to dust out those cobwebs, right? Okay, so the action potential is propagated down the nerve or the axon by sodium voltage gated channels. So sodium voltage gated channels pop open, sodium rushes in and depolarizes the axon terminal. And then, or excuse me, the axon. when it gets to the terminal region, what ion comes in? So we're at number 2. And if you look at it, it says calcium ions. So calcium ions come into the cell and depolarize the axon terminal region. So it's not sodium as before, it's actually calcium. So these are calcium voltage gated channels that pop open. Calcium rushes into the axon terminal region, and it's a +2, so it's going to happen. It's going to excite this region way faster than sodium would. And then the calcium, once it's inside, it's going to merge with this vesicle containing neurotransmitters. It's going to exocytose the neurotransmitter into the synaptic cleft, right? This neurotransmitter, so actually at number 3, notice how it doesn't tell you what neurotransmitter it is, but it's actually acetylcholine. And acetylcholine, we'll go over the spelling of that in a little bit, but you can write ACH as the abbreviation. So acetylcholine is released from the synapse. We're looking at number 4 then, that acetylcholine is going to bind to receptors on the second nerve, or we call this the postsynaptic nerve, and that's number 5. And so when acetylcholine binds to these receptors, it's going to pop open these receptors, and sodium is going to rush in. So what type of a channel is this? This is actually a ligand-gated channel, right? So acetylcholine binds to these receptors, pops them open, sodium rushes in and depolarizes this region, and then the action potential gets generated down the second nerve. And so one nerve communicates with a second nerve, or the presynaptic nerve communicates with the postsynaptic nerve via neurotransmitter. This is how nerves communicate with nerves, or nerves communicate with organs. There's one thing that I want to go over with you guys, is that students think that when the acetylcholine binds to this receptor that it stays stuck to that receptor, and it actually doesn't. It just binds and releases, binds, releases, binds, releases, binds, releases. And when it binds this receptor, the receptor pops open and depolarizes the second nerve. And so as long as acetylcholine is in that synapse, it can just keep binding and binding and binding and binding and exciting the second nerve, or the postsynaptic nerve. How do we get the acetylcholine out of the synapse? It's either broken down by enzymes that are attached to the second nerve membrane, or it's pulled up into the first nerve, or the presynaptic nerve, integrated. Okay. Here's a picture. So how does cocaine affect the synapse? So if you look, here's your presynaptic nerve, here's your synapse, and here's your postsynaptic nerve. Normally, when the presynaptic nerve gets excited, it releases, in this case, it would be dopamine onto the dopamine receptors, right? And gets the postsynaptic nerve excited. Then the dopamine is pulled back in to the first nerve using a transport channel. How does cocaine affect this? Well, cocaine sits on that transport channel, or blocks that transport channel. So that dopamine stays in the synapse longer, because it can't get broken down. And if it stays in the synapse longer, it's going to keep binding and exciting the second nerve. That's why cocaine gives you extreme strength and long-term energy, because dopamine is constantly triggering the secondary nerve. A lot of different types of drugs work this way, not just cocaine. So for example, antidepressants work the same way. So antidepressants will sit on the serotonin reuptake inhibitor, so that serotonin stays in the synapse longer, and keep triggering the postsynaptic nerve, or excitation of that postsynaptic nerve. Your nervous system organization. So the central nervous system is your brain and spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is everything outside of the brain and spinal cord. So okay, let me see. All right, so let me get back to what we were saying. I got interrupted, I'm sorry. Okay, so central nervous system consists of two parts, your central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system, everything outside of the brain and spinal cord, uh, sensory nerves are part of your peripheral nervous system as well as motor nerves. Sensory nerves take signals from a stimulus receptor to the central nervous system. And then motor nerves go from central nervous system to effectors like muscles and glands. So sensory neurons are afferent, they're going to go to the brain. And then motor nerves are efferent, they're going to exit the brain. The sensory nerves, let me see. So when we talked about thermoreceptors would be an example of a sensory nerve. It's going to go from your skin to your hypothalamus, right? And then a motor nerve is going to come from either hypothalamus or medulla oblongata out to different types of muscles and glands to cause some type of an effect. For the peripheral nervous system, we have two divisions. We have the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. Somatic nervous system evaluates external environment and rules skeletal muscle. Via neuromuscular junctions, we have 12 pairs of cranial nerves and 31 pairs of spinal nerves. So here's an example of the somatic nervous system. So the cell body originates in the central nervous system in the middle of your brain. And then the axon goes out and connects with skeletal muscle. Notice that this somatic nerve releases acetylcholine, and it's actually going to bind to a receptor called a nicotinic cholinergic receptor. And the spelling of that is in a subsequent slide. So when acetylcholine binds to this nicotinic cholinergic receptor on the skeletal muscle, it's going to cause the skeletal muscle to become excited and ultimately contract, right? So why did they call this a nicotinic cholinergic receptor? Because it binds nicotine, and that's how it was discovered. Your autonomic nervous system evaluates internal environments. Your autonomic nervous system has sensory nerves that are sending signals from the body to the brain. So think of your baroreceptors that are enmeshed in your carotid sinus and your aortic arch. These guys send action potentials to the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata evaluates it and then sends a signal out to the heart to cause some type of change. So the autonomic nervous system is responsible for homeostasis of your internal organs of your body. So they antagonistically control cardiac smooths and glands for homeostasis. These lead to your autonomic reflexes, and there are agonists and antagonists in research and medicine. So agonists mimic neurotransmitters, and antagonists block or inhibit neurotransmitters. So agonists are like analogs of neurotransmitters or hormones, and antagonists block that. Just to review, the hypothalamus is located in this region, below the thalamus, right? And then above the pituitary. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that when we get into endocrine. Here is your pons region of your brainstem, and then your medulla region. The medulla region is responsible for respirations, so breathing rate, blood pressure, heart rate, force of contraction for heart. And then your hypothalamus is responsible for temperature regulation, water balance, but more so think of osmolarity of blood, and then eating behavior. And your pons oversees respiration and urinary control. Your autonomic nervous system consists of two subdivisions, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. What do? So they work in concert to maintain homeostasis in your body. So sympathetic is typically known as your fight or flight response, or that's the nervous system that's responsible for fight or flight, right? And then parasympathetic is responsible for your rest and digest response. And so you can think of sympathetic nervous system kicks up when you get up in the morning or you're sitting in traffic and you're running late. And then when you eat lunch or when you're sitting in lecture, parasympathetic kicks up and sympathetic tones down. And then when you get home at night and you're eating dinner, parasympathetic kicks up where sympathetic tones down. Let's say you go out and exercise, which one kicks up? Right? Sympathetic kicks up while you're out exercising. Parasympathetic tones down or quiets down. And then you go to bed at night, parasympathetic is going to kick up. So the point of this is that to each organ, or you have both nervous systems synapsing, well, most of organs, both nervous systems are synapsing to the heart or synapsing to the digestive tract to regulate them. So if you're talking about heart, if you're trying to flee, what would that entail? So sympathetic nervous system is going to cause heart rate and force of contraction to go up for heart. And then if you're sleeping at night, parasympathetic nervous system is going to cause your heart to decrease heart rate and decrease force of contraction, right? Because you don't need to be pumping that hard. You don't need blood pressure high when you're resting and digesting. I'd like you to know the different subdivisions, so sympathetic and parasympathetic, what they do, the neurotransmitter that they release, and the hormone, if there is one, the receptor they bind to, and then the action that they have for the heart and the GI tract, right? So let's go over this. The difference between parasympathetic and sympathetic, the spinal cord exit, and the neurotransmitters they release, the receptors that bind those neurotransmitters, and then the activity of the target tissues. If you take a look, the vagus nerve is actually one of our main parasympathetic nerves. It exits out the medulla, and this was one of the cranial nerves that you had to learn. Do you guys remember what cranial nerve it was? Okay, it was cranial nerve 10. So it synapses with, you can tell your muscle, your salivary glands, right? Take a look at how it wraps around the heart, lungs, and then it goes into the digestive tract. Okay, here's side-by-side comparison. So sympathetic is on your left and parasympathetic is on your right. Sympathetic exits the central nervous system from T1 to L2, connects in the chain ganglion, and we're going to look at the heart. So there's a cardiac nerve that innervates, a sympathetic cardiac nerve that innervates the heart. Take a look at the parasympathetic nervous system. Most of the parasympathetic nervous system is originated from cranial nerve 10. It's going to synapse with the lungs, heart, stomach, digestive tract. But notice that S2 through S4 innervates your large intestine, rectum, bladder, and genitalia. L1 and L2 for sympathetic innervates the rectum, bladder, and genitalia. So if you have damage anywhere in that lumbar region, that's going to affect rectum and bladder and genitalia control as far as your sacral region. In addition to, when they're doing a spinal tap, when they want to take cerebrospinal fluid, they're going to inject below L2, the vertebrae L2 or in between L2 and L3 to pull out some cerebrospinal fluid, because that's where they're less likely to cause damage. If you've ever been pregnant and had an epidural, the epidural is inserted into this region as well, so that it is into the space so that you're numb from your waist down. Here's a side-by-side comparison of your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. Take a look. Let me change the color of the laser. Let's do green because it'll stick out better. So here's sympathetic nervous system on your left, and then on your right is parasympathetic nervous system. Notice this is the first nerve So here's your first neuron, and then it synapses with a second neuron, and then it synapses with your target organ or your effector, right? Same thing with parasympathetic. So first, second nerve, and then target organ. Notice that the first nerve, or the presynaptic nerve, so here's the presynaptic neuron, here's a synapse, here's a postsynaptic neuron, and then here's the effector. So this first nerve releases neurotransmitter, which is going to be acetylcholine, onto nicotinic cholinergic receptors and excites the second nerve. This is the same whether we're talking about sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous system. Where are they different then? So sympathetic nervous system is going to release norepinephrine onto adrenergic receptors on the heart and GI tract and cause some type of response on the heart and GI tract. Whereas in the parasympathetic nervous system, acetylcholine is going to bind to muscarinic cholinergic receptors and on the target organ and cause a response for that one. We can skip this. This is the adrenal gland. So a sympathetic nerve synapses with a chromaffin cell in your adrenal medulla, and that's going to release epinephrine out or release catecholamines. Catecholamines are locally acting chemicals, about 80% epinephrine, 20% norepinephrine, and a little bit of dopamine. And so that adrenal gland is going to release epi into your whole abdominal region, into the blood. And so that's going to have an effect on your whole body. I can skip that one, Take a look at the neurotransmitters. So for sympathetic, the dominant neurotransmitter is norepinephrine. The receptor type that it binds to are alpha and beta adrenergic receptors. So how do I remember the receptor type? I think of epinephrine is adrenaline and norepinephrine is noradrenaline. So adrenaline binds to adrenergic receptors. The inactivation enzyme, not that you have to know that for an exam, but it's monoamine oxidase. And so when norepi is released onto these adrenergic receptors, MAO is going to break down the norepi. The old school antidepressants were MAOI or MAOIs, which is monoamine oxidase inhibitors, and they inhibited norepi from getting broken down, or they blocked the inactivation enzyme, the MAO, so that it couldn't break down norepinephrine. So norepi actually sat in that synapse and stimulated nerves. For parasympathetic, the neurotransmitter is acetylcholine. Acetylcholine binds to both nicotinic and muscarinic cholinergic receptors. So here's a spelling for those. Nicotinic is named nicotinic because it binds nicotine. Muscarinic is named muscarinic because it binds a muscarine, which is a toxin. And both of those are subcategories of cholinergic receptors. The inactivation enzyme, or the enzyme that actually breaks down acetylcholine, is called acetylcholine esterase, and we abbreviate that ACHE. So acetylcholine esterase is the enzyme that breaks down acetylcholine in that synapse. And we'll see that again when we get into skeletal muscle. Okay, so take a look at the different types of organs. So I put this in here because in your professional programs, you're going to have to know it in a little bit more depth. So here's your effector organ, right? Here is your sympathetic response and the adrenergic receptor. There's actually alpha adrenergic receptors, beta adrenergic receptors, and to make it more complicated, there's alpha 1, beta 1, and alpha 2 and beta 2. And then there's a parasympathetic response. So let's look at the heart. If your sympathetic nervous system stimulates your heart, it's going to increase heart rate and force of contraction for that heart, right? What's the the dominant receptor on the heart, it's going to be beta-1 adrenergic receptors. For right now, for this exam, you just have to know adrenergic, and we'll get into a little bit more depth when we get into cardiovascular system. For parasympathetic nervous system, parasympathetic nervous system is going to slow down rate and force of contraction of the heart by binding to muscarinic cholinergic receptors. Take a look at the lungs. Lungs, actually no, sorry, let's do digestive tract. Digestive tract, oh, right below lungs. Digestive tract, so if you notice that when you are resting and digesting, which nervous system is paramount or dominant? It's going to be your parasympathetic nervous system, and so it's going to increase motility and secretions. Whereas if you are in your fight or flight mode, you're triggering your sympathetic nervous system, it's going to decrease motility and secretions of your digestive tract, because you don't want to be digesting that Big Mac while you're fleeing for your life, right? And then it covers the receptor types. And so once we get to the end of the PowerPoint, I'm going to go over heart and digestive tract again. Those are the two that I want you to know for this exam. Take a look at the lungs. So lungs, the sympathetic nervous system causes the bronchioles to dilate via beta-2 adrenergic receptors. And the parasympathetic causes the bronchioles to constrict. So let's go over an example of anaphylactic shock. So let's say you eat some peanuts and you're allergic to them. Your capillaries are going to get leaky, right? So your mast cells in your basophils release a lot of histamine and heparin. And so that's going to cause swelling of your digestive tract, swelling of your trachea. It can swell shut. And so, and you get edema, and your blood pressure drops significantly. So what's the treatment for that? They're actually going to give you epi, or they're going to inject you with an EpiPen, or you're going to give yourself an epi injection. How does that epi affect the lungs? So that epi is going to bind to beta-2 adrenergic receptors and dilate those bronchioles, or open up those airways so that you can actually breathe. Whereas it is going to, if you look at the arterioles and veins, that epinephrine is going to constrict those arterioles so that you can, so that blood pressure is going to go back up, and it's going to increase heart contractions and rate. So it's actually really interesting. Notice how arterioles and veins don't have a parasympathetic nervous system synapsing with them. Same thing with adrenal medulla, your kidney, and your adipose, and your lymph tissue. Here's comparison of these. So heart, sinoatrial node, atrioventricular node, and force of contraction. Sympathetic, when the sympathetic nervous system is triggered, it's going to increase heart rate, conduction velocity, and force of contraction via beta-1 adrenergic receptors. Parasympathetic nervous system is going to drop heart rate, conduction velocity, and force of contraction. Digestive tract, parasympathetic is going to increase motility and stimulation for secretions, and it's going to relax those sphincters. So it's going to help move food and nutrients through the digestive tract. Whereas if you're running for your life, your digestive tract is really inhibited. Okay, and you can look through these. It's really interesting now that you've gone over metabolism with the liver and the adipose tissue. You can appreciate that a sympathetic nervous system stimulates glycogenolysis, which is breaking down glycogen, or gluconeogenesis, which is making new glucose from fats or proteins, or stimulates breakdown of lipids as well. Okay, here's a picture that I drew. It's not great, but I want you guys to practice drawing this out. So start with the somatic and autonomic nervous system. So those are two different divisions of the peripheral nervous system. Somatic regulates skeletal muscle, right? Whereas autonomic consists of the subdivisions sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. If you take a look at somatic nervous system, let me actually change the color of the pen to blue and see how that looks. Okay, that's better contrast. So somatic nervous system, here's your presynaptic nerve. So that's your first nerve, right? And then there's a synapse, and then there's a postsynaptic nerve, and then there's another synapse, and then it is the organ. So here's your skeletal muscle. So somatic nervous system regulates your skeletal muscle contraction. So the first nerve releases acetylcholine. That binds to nicotinic cholinergic receptors and excites the second nerve. That second nerve is going to release acetylcholine, and that's going to bind to nicotinic cholinergic receptors on the skeletal muscle and excite the skeletal muscle. And so notice how nerve 1 to nerve 2 is acetylcholine binding to nicotinic cholinergic receptors, and then nerve 2 to skeletal muscle is acetylcholine to nicotinic cholinergic receptors, and it's going to cause skeletal muscle contraction. If you take a look at sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system, they're the same as somatic for the first synapse. So that first synapse is the same. And so there's nothing new there. So acetylcholine is going to be released in sympathetic and at parasympathetic. It's going to bind to nicotinic cholinergic receptors on the second nerve, and then that's going to excite the second nerve. But where sympathetic and parasympathetic vary or deviate is the second nerve to the effector. So if we're talking about if we're talking about sympathetic nervous system is going to release norepinephrine, is the neurotransmitter, and epinephrine is the hormone analog. These are going to bind to adrenergic receptors. Here's my little receptor, and here's my adrenergic receptor on the heart, and increase heart rate and force of contraction. We can do heart rate for right now, but you'll learn this is cardiac output, and it's going to slow down digestion. So this is my digestive tract. That's my adrenergic receptors. So when epi and norepi bind to the adrenergic receptors on the GI tract, it's going to slow down contractions of that GI tract. Parasympathetic nervous system, if you look at the dominant neurotransmitter, it's acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is going to bind to muscarinic cholinergic receptors on the heart. And what does it do? It's going to slow down your heart, right? Whereas muscarinic cholinergic receptors, when acetylcholine binds to these on the digestive tract, it's going to increase contractions or increase motility. Okay, and so you can see how the same neurotransmitter binding to the same receptor causes different things to happen depending on the organ or effector. Okay, so for this PowerPoint, what do you need to know? You need to know the different nervous systems, right? I want you to know the neurotransmitters released from the nerves, or the hormone release. So the neurotransmitters, we have norepi and acetylcholine. The hormone is epinephrine. The receptor type that they bind to, so is it a nicotinic cholinergic receptor? Is it a muscarinic cholinergic receptor? Is it an adrenergic receptor? And then what's the effect on the target organ? And again, if we go back to this diagram that I drew out, make sure that you're drawing this out and practice this. I always say practice 5 to 10 times, drawing it out and teaching it and talking through it, so that you know that you can do this when you see an exam question. Okay, thanks for doing my online lecture number 1. See you soon.